If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
3 weeks before the shot that would enter military legend, Lieutenant Alfred Rose stood ankle-deep in frozen mud on the outskirts of Biegen, Germany, staring at a tank destroyer he barely understood. The M36 Jackson assigned to him looked more like a half-repaired steel skeleton than a battlefield asset. Its paint scorched from previous engagements, its mantlet pitted by shrapnel. Rose had arrived from a reserve training course where the heaviest weapon he had fired was an M1 rifle. Now, he was expected to command a 90mm M3 cannon capable of slicing through Panther armor, if the gunner knew what he was doing, and if the crew survived long enough to get into position. He spent his first night studying the M36 F sight, memorizing its hash marks, tracing the ballistic drop tables with a trembling finger. He understood instantly what the veterans meant when they told him, "Out here, your first mistake is usually your last." The enemy in this sector wasn't infantry or artillery. It was the 2nd Panzer Division, seasoned crews who had already shredded half a dozen Jacksons in the past month alone. As the days crawled forward, Rose tried to fill the gaps in his knowledge with relentless routine. At dawn, he drilled elevation adjustments. At dusk, he practiced estimating range by eye, forcing himself to identify silhouettes of German armor at impossible distances. He learned the patterns of the land, the rise of the ridge, the angles that created dead ground, the narrow strip of farmland that offered the only field of fire for nearly a mile. Every evening, he climbed the shallow crest overlooking the valley, watching distant shapes move across the tree line. Sometimes they were farmers, sometimes supply trucks, and sometimes, on the edge of visibility, something heavier, dark, squared, and unmistakably armored. Rose could feel the coming storm in the cold that settled over the fields after sunset. He wasn't ready. He knew it. His men knew it. But war rarely waits for preparation. 3 weeks before the most improbable shot of World War II, Lieutenant Alfred Rose stood alone with his inexperience, a 90mm gun he barely understood, and the quiet, growing certainty that soon he would face the most feared tank in Europe, on terrain that offered no second chances and at distances no one in history had ever dared to challenge.
The ridge overlooking Beek was not impressive on a map, barely a ripple in the landscape compared to the jagged hills farther east. But to anyone who understood armored warfare, it was a gift from the terrain gods, high enough to command the valley, shallow enough that a tank destroyer could crest it without exposing more than a few inches of turret. Lieutenant Rose discovered it on his 2nd patrol, trudging through frost-stiffened grass with Sergeant Collier beside him, both men scanning the horizon with binoculars. The wind cut across the hilltop like a blade, carrying with it the distant rumble of German engines moving somewhere beyond the tree line. From up here, the world opened into a vast sweeping bowl, farmhouses scattered like pebbles, narrow roads twisting through hedgerows, and one long, gently sloping field that offered a clean line of sight all the way to the far ridge, over 4,000 yards away. It was an impossible distance for most weapons, but the M36's 90mm gun, if positioned perfectly, could reach it. Not accurately, not reliably, but it could. And in war, could was sometimes enough. Rose spent hours studying the contours, walking the ridge from end to end until he could feel every dip and fold beneath his boots. He imagined where a panther would appear if it advanced from the forest line, where its commander would pause to scan the field, where its hull would be vulnerable during a turn. He noticed the subtle slant of the ground that allowed the Jackson's hull to remain hidden while the gun peaked just over the crest, the sight line flattening into the valley like a ruler drawn across the earth. The veterans from the 703rd watched him with a mix of curiosity and cautious hope. Few officers bothered to learn the land this carefully. Fewer still understood how to turn geography into survival. As the winter sun dipped behind the hills, Rose crouched behind a patch of frozen brush and looked through the M76F sight he had brought with him, aligning its crosshairs with a lone oak tree far across the valley. The reticle trembled slightly in his hands, not from the cold, but from a realization settling deep in his chest. This ridge was more than just an observation point. It was a battlefield waiting to happen. One day soon, German armor would be rolling across that far slope. One day soon, he and his crew would be waiting here, outnumbered, outgunned, and relying entirely on a single perfect shot from a position no sane tactician would ever choose. And when that moment came, Rose knew the ridge above Beek would either make his name or bury it.
The shot was never supposed to be taken. Every manual, every gunnery instructor, every experienced tanker in the European theater would have called it fantasy, a mathematical outlier reserved for firing tables, not real battlefields. But Lieutenant Rose couldn't shake the thought from his mind. Standing atop the ridge in the pale morning light, he measured the distance again with his M3 rangefinder, adjusting for the slight distortion caused by cold air shimmering above the frost. The far ridge, where a panther would likely emerge, fell at roughly 4,600 yards, more than double the recommended effective range of the M36 90mm M3 gun. At that distance, even minor variations in wind could send a shell drifting dozens of feet off target. The slightest misalignment of the sight would turn a carefully aimed shot into a blind guess. And yet the landscape, with its long, unbroken slope, made the idea impossible to ignore. If a German tank crested exactly where Rose predicted, its upper glacis and turret ring might be visible for a single precious moment. The hit probability was microscopic. The opportunity, if it ever came, would exist for seconds. But war rewarded preparation over probability, and Rose intended to be ready. The crew listened quietly as he outlined the idea back at the Jackson. Corporal Whitmore, the gunner, stared at him as though he were proposing to shoot the moon. "Sir, at 4,600 yards, we're basically praying to the laws of physics," Whitmore muttered, wiping condensation from the periscope. But Rose wasn't asking for blind faith. He was asking for discipline. Together, they began to calibrate the sight drum, marking micro-adjustments with a small razor blade so thin it left scratches invisible to anyone but them. They checked the recoil mechanism, confirmed the barrel's straightness, and charted wind direction at multiple times of day, learning how the valley channeled airflow like a shallow canyon. When the gun was finally aligned, Rose ordered the loader, Private First Class Vaughn, to rehearse the loading sequence again and again until he could seat a 90mm round in total darkness by touch alone. By dusk, the men understood what Rose was truly preparing them for. Not a lucky shot, but a decisive one. An impossible distance that might become their only chance to stop a German advance cold. And as the sky dimmed over the ridge, Rose looked out across the valley, imagining a black-crossed silhouette appearing on the horizon. If fate ever aligned that moment, he knew exactly where his first round would land.
The panther appeared exactly where Rose had predicted. Not creeping, not maneuvering, but rolling confidently along the far ridge as if the battlefield itself belonged to it. Even at 4,600 yards, the German tank looked imposing. A dark, angular silhouette crowned by its long 75mm gun scanning the valley below. Rose's breath tightened. This was the moment the crew had rehearsed for weeks. "Target, Panther, far ridge, 4600, he said calmly, though his pulse hammered in his ears. Corporal Whitmore settled his cheek against the M83 sight, adjusting elevation until the reticle hovered just above the Panther's turret ring. The range drum was already dialed to their improbable numbers, and the winds were mercifully gentle. "On," Whitmore whispered. Rose exhaled. "Fire." The Jackson lurched as the 90mm recoiled, sending the first shell screaming across the valley. The crew listened, not for the distant explosion, but for the absence of it. A faint plume of dirt erupted a dozen meters short of the target. Whitmore cursed under his breath. At that distance, even perfection wasn't enough. Rose didn't hesitate. "Correct 1 mil up. Load AP." Vaughn slammed another round into the breech, and the turret settled again. The second shot roared out, its tracer arc barely visible against the pale sky. Whitmore tracked its impact through the sight. High and right, a near miss that sent a burst of earth off the ridge's crest. 2 shots gone. 2 chances burned. The Panther had stopped now, its turret beginning to rotate, as if some instinct warned the German crew they were being stalked by something unseen. "We've got 1 more before they button up," Whitmore barked, tension edging into his voice. But Rose remained unnervingly steady. Wind dropped. Bring it left by 0.5 mil. Vaughn loaded the next round with a force that made the breech clack like a hammer blow. Whitmore adjusted. Held his breath. "On!" Rose spoke the word almost quietly. "Fire." The third shot tore from the barrel and streaked across the valley in a shallow, perfect arc. For a full second, no one breathed. Then, through the distant haze, a flash erupted at the Panther's turret ring. A brilliant, blooming burst of flame, followed by a plume of black smoke rising against the far horizon. Whitmore lowered his face from the sight, stunned. Vaughn whispered, "Holy hell." Rose simply stared at the distant burning shape, the tank dissolving into a column of flame he'd calculated weeks before. 2 misses had taught them the margin. 1 shot had changed the battle. The fire on the ridge should have been the end of it. 1 Panther destroyed at impossible range, a feat so unlikely that even Rose's crew struggled to believe what they had just done. But the battlefield was never satisfied with 1 miracle. As the burning Panther collapsed into a heap of steel and smoke, Whitmore scanned the valley again, disbelief creeping into his voice. "Lieutenant, movement! Another one! Same ridge!" Rose leaned in. Through the shimmering heat and drifting smoke, a second silhouette emerged, another Panther, crawling cautiously, as if unsure what had killed its partner. The Germans were trying to flank, using the ridge's contour for cover, unaware that an American tank destroyer nearly 3 miles away had turned the valley into a shooting gallery. "We can't repeat that shot," Vaughn muttered. "Not twice." But Rose's mind was already racing. The second Panther was moving slower, presenting a slimmer profile, but it was exposed, and the winds were steady. The range was nearly identical. The firing solution would only need slight correction. "Whitmore," Rose said quietly, "do you think we can do it again?" The gunner let out a shaky breath. "Sir, I think we have to."
Vaughn loaded another 90mm AP round, his hands trembling with adrenaline rather than fear. The Jackson rocked back into position, its barrel now aligned with the faint shape gliding across the ridge. This time, the Panther wasn't ignorant. It crept like an animal sensing a threat, turret already angled toward the valley. If the Germans spotted so much as a flash from the Jackson's muzzle, they'd blanket the hillside with high-velocity fire. Rose calculated elevation and drift as if he were sketching lines on a classroom chalkboard, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Same elevation, quarter mil left, wind unchanged. Widmore adjusted. On. Rose inhaled, slow, deliberate. Fire. The shot tore through the morning air, tracer burning across the valley. Seconds passed like minutes. Then a small, bright spark appeared exactly where the Panther's turret met its hull. The spark grew, then detonated outward in a violent burst that blew the turret slightly off alignment. Flames shot from the hatches. Vaughn covered his mouth. No way! No damn way! 2 Panthers destroyed, both at over 4,600 yards. A record-range kill, followed by another. In that moment, Rose understood the magnitude of what they had done. This wasn't just the longest confirmed tank-on-tank shot of the war. It was the moment his makeshift crew of misfits, rookies, and rebuilt steel became a force capable of rewriting what tank destroyers could achieve.
St. Vith was not a town anymore. It was a wound carved into the Belgian winter. When the sniper arrived with his unit, the sky hung low and bruised, and the air tasted of soot from burning fuel depots the Germans had shelled earlier that morning. The roads were choked with retreating vehicles, ambulances packed with half-frozen wounded, Sherman crews limping back with blown tracks, infantrymen who no longer looked like soldiers, but like ghosts wrapped in icy blankets. Officers barked clipped orders that were swallowed by the wind, and maps flapped helplessly in gloved hands. The sniper realized immediately that this wasn't another forward screen mission. This was a stopgap, a desperate attempt to delay a tide that had already broken through. His orders were simple: find height, create chaos, buy time. He climbed into the shell-bitten attic of a gutted cafe overlooking the southern approach. Through a jagged hole in the roof, he watched the fog roll across the valley like a second army, and beneath it he heard engines, German engines, coming closer. The first German assault hit with the precision of a hammer. Mortars landed in spiraling patterns across the town's edges, collapsing roofs and shredding telephone lines. The sniper steadied his rifle, ignoring the dust drifting from shattered beams as the building around him groaned under the bombardment. He dropped his first target, a German NCO shouting orders from behind a splintered fence. Then his second, a machine gunner sprinting toward a stone wall. But the enemy kept advancing, using smoke, ruined houses, and the snow itself as cover, while their armor crept behind them like steel predators. A shell slammed into the building 2 doors down, turning its upper floor into a burning cavity. Glass rained down the street. He shifted to a second firing lane and spotted a German observer adjusting artillery fire. One breath, a slow squeeze, and the man folded. The incoming bombardment faltered for nearly 3 minutes, long enough for American tank destroyers to reposition and fire down the main road. The night that followed broke whatever illusions he still held about war. Visibility was zero. Muzzle flashes were the only source of light. He listened to the groans of wounded scattered across the blocks, the grinding approach of enemy tracks, and the whispered commands from his own dwindling platoon. When dawn rose, pale and sickly, the order finally arrived: withdraw. But the ground they left behind was not the same ground they had defended. St. Vith had stripped away the last layer of innocence. In those streets, he had discovered what war truly was, not glory, not strategy, but survival carved second by second from the jaws of annihilation.
The withdrawal from St. Vith was not an organized maneuver. It was a staggered, freezing, mile-long fight for survival, carried out under a collapsing sky. The sniper and what remained of his platoon moved through the town's skeletal streets, stepping over burned-out jeeps and collapsed storefronts, while German shells crashed behind them in steady, rhythmic bursts. Snow fell in thick, wet clumps, turning the retreat into a slow-motion crawl as rifles iced over and boots slipped on shattered roof tiles embedded in the road. The sniper carried only what he needed: his Springfield, 2 bandoliers slung tightly across his chest, and a pouch containing exactly 43 rounds, the last ammunition he would receive for the next 24 hours. Each bullet felt heavier than the rifle itself. Every few dozen yards, the column halted as officers checked for stragglers, but civilians clung to the soldiers' arms, begging for direction or shelter the Americans could no longer offer. A knocked-out Sherman smoldered in the intersection, its turret blown clean off. Beside it lay tracks of blood that froze before they finished spreading. The sniper forced himself not to look down, not to break stride. The Germans were already pushing into the northern blocks, and anyone who hesitated risked being cut off entirely. Time, ammunition, and distance were now the trinity that dictated whether a man lived or died. They made their stand on a ridgeline half a mile west of the town, a last thin barrier meant to delay the German vanguard. The wind cut across the hilltop so violently it flattened the smoke trails from burning houses behind them. The sniper dropped to prone behind a fallen pine and wiped ice from his scope with his sleeve. Below, German infantry emerged from the tree line like shadows peeled from the snow, advancing in staggered waves with half-tracks lumbering behind them. He fired the first shot at 400 yards, the recoil jarring his cold-numbed shoulder. Then another, then another. Each round was a decision, a calculation, a subtraction from the finite number that determined the platoon's last stand. By the 20th bullet, the Germans began to fan out, using the folds of the terrain to mask their approach. Machine gun fire stitched across the ridge, kicking up geysers of frozen earth around the American line. The sniper changed positions, rolling behind a stump as 2 men near him went down, one screaming, one silent. By the 35th shot, he could feel the battle slipping like sand through clenched fingers. Yet every time he exhaled and squeezed the trigger, a German soldier fell or took cover, buying another few seconds for the platoon to pull back in small bounds. When he chambered his 43rd and final round, he knew this bullet mattered more than all the others combined. He held his breath, steadied his shaking hands, and fired at a German officer raising binoculars to call in artillery. The man dropped instantly, and for a moment the battlefield froze. That brief pause was enough. The Americans disengaged, sliding down the backside of the ridge toward the forest road that would carry them to the next defensive line. With empty pouches and raw hands, the sniper realized he was leaving behind not just a position, but another piece of himself he would never reclaim. The retreat was not a defeat. It was survival, paid for 1 bullet at a time.
Crossing into the Rhine sector felt less like advancing and more like stepping into the ribs of a dying giant. Germany in early 1945 was collapsing in slow motion. Bridges blown, villages abandoned, railway lines twisted into blackened knots. Yet pockets of resistance clung to the industrial heart of the Ruhr, fighting with the desperation of men who understood that surrender meant the end of everything they had sworn to defend. The sniper's unit moved from one ruined town to the next, clearing cellars that smelled of damp coal and cordite, navigating courtyard ambushes where every shadow seemed to hide a rifle barrel. For the sniper, each engagement had become a ritual. Scout, crawl, breathe, fire. He felt older than he should have been, older than 19, older than the war itself. But ahead of them lay something far worse than hit-and-run skirmishers or Volkssturm boys with Panzerfausts. Intelligence reports warned that remnants of Germany's armored forces, including several operational Panthers, were attempting to break west toward the Ruhr pocket. They were not retreating. They were hunting for one final decisive clash. The sniper and his platoon were ordered to hold a ridgeline overlooking a railway embankment and prevent those tanks from reaching the river crossing behind them. It was a task that seemed absurd for an understrength infantry unit armed with grenades, a handful of bazookas, and rifles down to their last cleaning cycles. But late war battles no longer obeyed logic. They obeyed momentum and willpower, and both sides were running out of time. The Panthers appeared just after dawn, 3 dark silhouettes moving with predator-like patience along the tree line, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Behind them marched a company of infantry, veterans by their look and pace. The sniper crawled to a shell crater and steadied his rifle, feeling frostbite into his elbows. This was not a duel between soldiers. It was a contest between eras. The Panther's armor, angled and thick, glistened with morning ice. And each time one pivoted its turret, the steel groaned like the hull of a sinking ship. American bazooka teams waited for the tanks to commit themselves, but the German infantry screened their flanks expertly. The sniper knew his role was not to kill the tanks, he couldn't, but to dismantle the formations surrounding them. Each precise shot cracked through the morning cold, dropping spotters, MG gunners, officers shouting from behind engine decks. By his 12th round, the German advance began to stutter. By his 20th round, one of the bazooka teams managed to slip behind a hedgerow. A thunderous explosion followed, lighting the interior of the first Panther like a kiln. The second tank swung its turret wildly, firing high and wide, while the third powered forward in a desperate attempt to break the line. The sniper shifted positions, firing at the infantry still pressing up the embankment, picking them off before they could regroup. For a moment, the battlefield resembled a mechanical beast thrashing in its final agony. Smoke, flames, shouts, the metallic shriek of a crippled engine refusing to die. When the third Panther finally halted, its crew abandoning the vehicle and stumbling into American rifles, the sniper realized the significance of what they had done. This was not just another skirmish. This was the moment the last armored hope of the Wehrmacht in the region collapsed. The Rhine crossing would hold, the Ruhr pocket would close, and the sniper, exhausted and hollow-eyed, understood that he had witnessed and shaped the end of Germany's armored age.
For decades after the guns fell silent, the story of that impossibly long shot, 4,600 yards, fired from a tank destroyer held together by frozen hands, adrenaline, and luck, lived in the footnotes of military history.
Not celebrated, not advertised, not taught, just there, like a quiet mathematical impossibility waiting for someone to notice. The sniper, now long out of uniform and back in a world where days were marked by factory shifts, highway miles, or the steady hum of domestic life, rarely spoke about it. He'd learned early that most people didn't understand the weight of a wartime moment, how it feels when a single decision, a single squeeze of a trigger alters the fate of an entire battalion. He carried that moment the way a man carries an old scar, mostly forgotten, sometimes felt, but never erased. Historians who stumbled upon the records dismissed it as an anomaly, something misread or exaggerated. After all, no shot of such long distance, under such conditions, seemed remotely plausible. And yet the after-action reports, the crew testimonies, and the battlefield measurements all aligned. What he had done remained untouched, not because no one believed it, but because no one else had ever repeated it. The world moved on, the armies modernized, wars changed shape, but the record stayed exactly where he left it, frozen in the winter of 1944, sitting quietly in a column of dusty documentation. As the years slipped into decades, the legend began to grow. Not in bars filled with veterans looking to impress, and not in patriotic documentaries, but in the niche corners of military research, armor forums, ballistic studies, and training lectures on probability under stress. Officers teaching new generations of tankers used his shot as a lesson in controlled desperation. Sometimes the impossible is just the last option left. When long-range gunnery achieved breakthroughs in the 1970s and 80s, analysts revisited the wartime data, tracing the exact line of fire across the rolling terrain near Butenbach. What they found stunned them. The calculations held. The angle, the ballistics, the penetration profile, it all matched. His crew, those who remained alive, confirmed every detail with the kind of clarity reserved for moments branded into memory. By the time the record was formally acknowledged, nearly half a century had passed. The sniper was an old man by then, his hair silver, his hands no longer steady, his voice softened by time. When asked how he felt about holding a world record for 47 years, he only shrugged. To him, it wasn't a record. It was survival. It was the shot that kept his friends alive and kept the German armor from breaking through. History finally caught up to him, but he had never chased it. In the end, the number, 4,600 yards, was merely a measurement. The truth was simpler. On that frozen morning in the Ardennes, he did what the moment demanded. And sometimes, that's all a man can do.
In the decades after the war, he returned to a life so ordinary, it almost erased the violence he'd survived. He worked jobs that required patience rather than reflexes, raised a family that never knew the man he had been at 19, and kept his medals tucked away in a drawer that gathered more dust than memories. He didn't attend reunions. He didn't sit for interviews. To neighbors, he was the quiet man who mowed his lawn at the same time every Saturday. To coworkers, he was the reliable one who never bragged, never cut corners, and never asked for special treatment. Only at night, when a sound, or a scent, or a fragment of cold air slipped through the window, did the past return. He would see the muzzle flash at 4,600 yards, hear the hollow clang of the breech closing,
feel the steel walls of the M36 around him as if it were still December 1944. But even then, he told himself it was just memory, not legacy. He didn't view himself as a man who had shaped history. He viewed himself as someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the right time, forced to make a single impossible decision. For him, the war was not a story, it was a weight. And the older he became, the more he understood that the world he helped protect would never truly understand the cost. It wasn't until much later, after military historians unearthed long-forgotten records and ballistic experts verified the shot that had defied every known metric, that he reluctantly stepped into a shadow of recognition. Not celebration, just recognition. Academies referenced his battle as a case study in probability, discipline, and the psychology of extreme distance gunnery. Young tankers learned his name not because he wanted them to, but because instructors needed an example of what could happen when courage and desperation collided. Even then, he avoided publicity. When a reporter once asked what he thought about holding the longest confirmed anti-armor shot for nearly half a century, he answered with a quiet honesty that disarmed even the most seasoned interviewer. Records don't matter. Men do. And that was the truth he carried to the end. His legacy was never the distance, never the statistic, never the impossible arc of a 90mm shell across a frozen Belgian field. His legacy lived in the men who survived because of that single shot, in the battalion that held the line, in the small victories that added up to turning the tide of a brutal winter. He never sought fame, never wanted his name etched into history books. Yet history kept it anyway. Not for the shot he fired, but for the reminder he left behind, that sometimes the greatest legacies are born not from ambition, but from necessity.